Rick stood in front of the rusty gate, holding the hand of his 7-year-old son. Max, the gate creaked as he pushed it open, and the smell of old metal filled the air. Before him stood the junkyard he had just inherited, a land full of broken cars, old machines, and piles of useless things. People from the town had told him to sell it, to walk away. Only a fool would keep that garbage land. One man laughed at the grocery store. Others just shook their heads and smiled with pity. When they saw Rick, he was a single father with no job and barely any savings. What would he do with a junkyard full of junk? But Rick didn't listen to the laughs or the doubts. He had made a promise to Max that they would build a better life. This junkyard wasn't just old metal to him, it was a chance. Even if it looked like nothing now, he believed something good could come from it. Max looked up at him and asked, "Are we going to live here now?" Rick smiled and nodded. "We're going to fix it, clean it up, and make it ours." The house beside the junkyard was small and dusty, but it had a roof, running water, and a working stove. Rick cleaned it up the first few days, washing old sheets and cooking simple meals for Max. Then each day after Max left for school, Rick worked in the junkyard. He sorted metal, pulled out wires, and looked for anything he could sell. Sometimes he made only a few dollars, but he kept trying. The work was hard, and the town kept laughing behind his back. One afternoon, as he was moving old crates in the back of the yard, Rick found something strange. There was a small wooden shed covered with vines and metal sheets. It looked forgotten, as if no one had entered it in years. Curious, Rick pushed open the heavy door, which groaned with age. Inside were old tools, cans, and boxes stacked high. Dust floated in the air like smoke, and everything smelled like old oil. But then he saw something odd. Under the corner of the shed, where the floor was uneven, there was a metal handle. Rick pulled at it, and to his surprise, part of the floor lifted, revealing a hidden hatch. It was locked with old military-style bolts. Rick knelt beside it, his hands shaking a little. Why was there a secret hatch under an old junk shed? He tried to open it, but it wouldn't move. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the old bolt he had unscrewed. Max came in with his teddy bear and asked, "Why are you still awake, Dad?" Rick smiled and sighed. "I think your uncle left us something. Something secret." Max's eyes lit up with curiosity, and he whispered, "Like treasure?" The next day, Rick returned to the hatch with better tools. He carefully removed each bolt, wiping sweat from his face. The metal was old and stiff, but he worked slowly, not wanting to break anything. Finally, after hours of struggle, the hatch creaked open with a loud groan. A stairwell led down into darkness. The air smelled old, like paper and rust. Rick grabbed a flashlight and took a deep breath before stepping inside. He didn't go far, just a few steps, but what he saw made his heart race. There were crates, lots of them, stacked along the walls of the hidden space. And they weren't like the junk he found outside. These were marked with old stamps. Some said U.S. Army, and others had symbols Rick didn't recognize. He stood there for a moment, the flashlight shaking in his hand. What had his uncle been hiding? He closed the hatch and climbed out, his mind spinning. The town may have laughed, but now Rick knew something they didn't. The junkyard wasn't just a place of broken machines. It was holding secrets, and maybe, just maybe, his life was about to change. That night, as he tucked Max into bed, he whispered, "I think we found something, kiddo." Max yawned and said, "Like a treasure?" Rick smiled, eyes full of hope. Yes, maybe even better. Outside, the wind moved through the junkyard like it was whispering a forgotten story. The story of a single dad, a curious hatch, and a mystery waiting to be uncovered. The world may have turned its back on Rick, but he had just taken the first step towards something incredible. And deep below the junk and dust, history was waiting to be found. Rick stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the junkyard. The morning sun was rising slowly, painting everything in a soft gold. He held a cup of cheap coffee, thinking about the hatch he found the day before. His hands were still sore from opening the bolts, but his heart was full of curiosity. He had seen those old military crates underground, and he knew they were not ordinary junk. Something important had been hidden there for many years, maybe even forgotten by time. Max ran into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, and asked, "Are we going exploring today, Dad?" Rick smiled and nodded. After breakfast, they ate toast and eggs, the kind of meal Rick could afford these days. But even simple food felt special because something had changed. Rick felt it deep in his bones. This junkyard had secrets, and he was ready to find them. After dropping Max at school, Rick went straight to the hatch. He brought a stronger flashlight and gloves, and this time, he climbed all the way down the stairs. The air was cooler underground, and dust swirled with every step. He slowly opened one of the crates, heart pounding like a drum. Inside was a strange machine, covered in cloth and metal parts. He pulled the cloth away and stared at it, confused but amazed. It looked like something from a movie, an old boxing machine, with letters, buttons, and wires. Rick didn't know what it was, but he knew it wasn't normal junk. He opened another crate. Inside were helmets, medals, and what looked like pieces of an old uniform. One more crate held maps and sealed boxes with faded labels. Each item was clean, well-preserved, and clearly from a different time. Rick sat on an old chair in the corner, breathing slowly. He whispered to himself, "What is all this doing here?" Later that evening, he searched the internet, typing descriptions of what he saw. He found images and articles that matched the machine. It was a real Enigma machine, used by the Germans in World War II to send secret codes. Only a few still existed, and collectors paid millions for working ones. Rick leaned back, shocked, his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't just sitting on some forgotten junk. This was history, and it was priceless. He called an old friend, Marcus, who worked as a part-time historian for the local museum. "Hey Marcus," Rick said, trying to sound calm, "can I show you something weird I found in my yard?" Marcus came the next morning, curious but doubtful. When Rick opened the hatch and led him downstairs, Marcus froze in place. He stared at the crates, eyes wide, and whispered, "Rick, do you have any idea what this is?" Rick chuckled nervously. "I was hoping you'd tell me." Marcus carefully examined the machine, the helmets, the documents. "This is real," he said slowly. "This stuff belongs in a museum, or even in a government archive." Rick felt a mix of fear and excitement. "Do you think it's worth anything?" Marcus looked at him seriously. "Rick, you might be sitting on a small fortune, maybe more." News began to spread. At first just among a few local people, then someone posted photos online. And suddenly Rick's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Strangers were calling, asking questions. Reporters knocking at his gate. One woman offered him $10,000 for just one helmet. Rick said no, but the attention made him nervous. He didn't know what to do next. All he knew was that the town, which once laughed at him, was now looking at him differently. Some neighbors who never spoke to him before were suddenly friendly, asking how he was. But Rick didn't trust it. He had one goal: protect what he found and figure out the full story before doing anything big. That night, he sat beside Max. On the couch, they watched cartoons, but Rick's mind was somewhere else. Max looked up and asked, "Did you find the treasure?" Rick smiled. "Maybe, but we're going to be careful, okay?" Max nodded, not fully understanding, but happy. His dad seemed hopeful. Rick went outside before bed and stared at the stars. The wind blew softly through the metal piles like a whisper from the past. He whispered back, "Uncle Joe, what were you hiding down there?" He still didn't know why his uncle had built that hidden room or why he never told anyone. But Rick had a feeling the answer was buried deeper than just metal and machines. This wasn't just about money. This was about a story, a legacy, and a chance to change everything. The single dad who was once called a fool had just taken the first real step into something incredible. And he wasn't turning back. Not now. Not ever. Something special had begun, and it was only the beginning. The sun was still low when Rick walked out to the junkyard with a small backpack, a flashlight, and a camera. He locked the gate behind him, not because he feared thieves, but because what he had found underground was no longer just old junk. It was something valuable, something connected to real history. He climbed down the hatch again, this time more prepared. His flashlight beam cut through the dust in silence as he looked at the crates once more. Rick moved slowly from one crate to another, opening them carefully. He saw more helmets, old leather boots, military coats, and faded patches. Some crates had strange metal devices he couldn't name. But one crate caught his attention. It was heavier than the rest and sealed tighter. He used a metal bar to pry it open, the old wood cracking as it gave way. Inside was something wrapped in thick cloth, tied with rope. Rick's hands shook a little as he untied it. He pulled back the cloth, and his eyes widened. It was another machine. But this one looked even older, with knobs, buttons, and wires. A small tag hung from it, faded but still readable. Enigma, property of Allied forces. 1945. He had only read about Enigma machines online. But to see a second one here, hidden under years of dust, was something else. He took a picture with his phone and gently placed the cloth back over it. There were papers, 2 maps marked with lines, names of European cities, even handwritten. Notes, some were in German, some in English. Rick didn't understand all of it, but he knew enough to feel the weight of what he'd discovered. These weren't toys or junk. These were tools of war. He imagined the soldiers who used them. The hands that turned the dials, the minds that made the plans. One folder, thick and tied with string, had a red stamp, "Top secret, do not open." Rick looked around the room as if someone might be watching. Then, carefully, he untied. Inside were old photographs, planes, tanks, soldiers, some injured, some smiling. There were also letters, typed and signed by names Rick didn't recognize. One line made him stop. "Do not let these fall into enemy hands." Rick sat down on a wooden crate, his heart beating fast. He wondered again why his Uncle Joe had hidden all of this. Was he just a collector? Or was he part of something bigger, something during the war no one knew about? He remembered how Uncle Joe never talked much about his younger days. He was quiet, always working in the back of the yard. Rick thought he just liked fixing things. But now he wasn't sure. Maybe his uncle had a secret, one he kept buried with the past. As Rick explored deeper, he found another section of the bunker. The wall was lined with green metal boxes, all labeled with codes and numbers. He opened one and found a row of pistols wrapped in cloth, still polished and clean. Another had binoculars, medals, and a rusted knife. But in the far corner, he saw a box that was different. It was covered in dust but had a golden lock on it. He picked it up and placed it on the floor. After a few minutes of trying, the lock clicked open. Inside was a thick leather-bound journal, old but well kept. Rick flipped through the pages. Most were handwritten, filled with short entries and strange codes. But then he saw a name written on the first page. Joseph R. Miller, his uncle. It was his uncle's journal. Rick felt a strange chill as he read the first few lines. The war ended, but the truth must stay buried. I did what I had to do. I kept what needed to be saved. One day, someone will understand. Rick closed the journal and held it tight. This wasn't just about valuable machines and rare items. This was about a personal mission his uncle had. Tried to protect something, maybe not for money or fame, but for history. And now Rick was the one who had found it. He packed the journal and a few small items in his bag and climbed back up into the daylight. The junkyard looked the same as before: piles of rusted cars, broken fences, weeds in the corners. But to Rick, it felt different now. He wasn't just the guy who inherited a useless yard. He was the keeper of something important, something hidden for decades. That night, he sat with Max on the porch. Max was playing with a toy truck and asked, "Did you find anything cool today?" Rick smiled softly. "Yeah, buddy. I think I found a secret from the war." Max's eyes lit up. "Like spies and treasure?" Rick nodded. Exactly like that. He didn't tell Max everything, not yet, but deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. There was more down there, more secrets, more history, more questions, and Rick was ready to find them all. No matter where the path led, because some stories deserved to be told, and his uncle's story was one of them, buried under years of silence and steel. But not anymore. The next few days felt like a dream for Rick. He could hardly believe what he had found under the junkyard. He kept going back down into the hidden room, checking the crates, reading the letters, and looking through his uncle's journal. Every time he opened a box, it was like opening a piece of history. There were tools used by soldiers, maps marked with secret codes, and uniforms with names still stitched on them. Rick handled everything with care, like he was touching memories frozen in time. He knew he couldn't keep it all to himself. It was too big, too important. So he reached out to a local history museum and told them he might have something they'd want to see. They sent a young historian named Karen to take a look. When she arrived and Rick showed her the secret hatch, she looked doubtful, but once she climbed down and saw the crates, her mouth dropped open. "This can't be real," she whispered, touching the Enigma machine with her gloves. Rick nodded. "It's real, all of it." Karen spent hours going through the items, taking pictures, making notes, and calling her director. "This isn't just a collection," she said. "This is a historical discovery." The museum director visited the next day. Along with two experts from the city, they were shocked to find such rare and well-preserved items in a junkyard. They told Rick the Enigma machine alone could be worth over $1 million. The rest of the items, uniforms, documents, weapons, were priceless to collectors and historians. Rick listened in silence, still trying to take it all in. His heart pounded with excitement, but also fear. What was he supposed to do with all of this? Sell it? Give it to a museum? Keep it safe? The experts offered to help him get the items valued properly. They also suggested Rick allow the museum to temporarily display some of the artifacts. Rick agreed, but on one condition: his uncle's name had to be part of the story. He wanted people to know who hid these treasures and why. He didn't want his uncle to be forgotten. Meanwhile, word spread fast. The local news came to interview him, and soon national media picked up the story. Rick appeared on morning shows and news websites. People were calling him the Junkyard historian and the single dad who found a fortune. The same people who once laughed at him now waved and smiled when they saw him in town. But Rick stayed humble. He told everyone, "I didn't find treasure, I found history." One day, a man in a black suit showed up at Rick's door. He said he worked for a private military collector and offered Rick a blank check for the Enigma machine. Rick politely refused. "It's not for sale." The man looked surprised, then left quietly. Rick could feel the pressure growing. People wanted what he had, but he was more interested in protecting it than becoming rich. Max, even at 7, started to understand that something big was happening. At school, kids asked him about the secret machines his dad found. He came home one day and said, "Dad, are we famous now?" Rick laughed, maybe just a little. He hugged Max tightly, thankful that this discovery might give them a better future. But he never let the fame get to his head. One night, Rick returned to the journal, reading more of Uncle Joe's words. "If you're reading this, it means you found it," one page said. "I couldn't let the world forget what we fought for, what we saved. Keep it safe, Rick. Tell the story when the time is right." Tears filled Rick's eyes. His uncle had trusted him, even after death, to do the right thing. He started writing down everything he had found. He made notes, took pictures, and began to organize the documents. He even began learning about World War II so he could understand what the items really meant. The more he learned, the more he realized this wasn't just about machines. It was about people, real men and women who lived, fought, and died, and somehow their memory ended up in his hands one morning. Rick was invited to speak at a local school. He brought a soldier's helmet, a canteen, and a photo of the Enigma machine. He told the kids, "History isn't just in books. Sometimes it's under our feet." The children listened with wide eyes, and Rick felt proud. He never thought he would be the one teaching others. He used to be just a man trying to survive, and now he was sharing something priceless. He knew he still had more to discover in that bunker. The story wasn't finished yet, but he had already taken the first big step. He had turned the forgotten Junkyard into something amazing, and he had turned the laughter of others into respect. Rick smiled quietly as he stood outside one evening. The wind passed through the old cars like a whisper. His uncle's voice seemed to echo in it. "Good job, kid," it said, and Rick believed it with all his heart. It was a cool morning when Rick returned to the bunker with a small tool bag. He had already shown many crates to the museum, but something still bothered him. There was one corner of the underground room that didn't feel right. The wall there looked different, like it had been patched or covered. He knocked on it with his knuckles, and the sound came back hollow. Rick's eyes narrowed, his hands steady. He picked up a crowbar and started to scrape at the wall. Dust and tiny bits of plaster fell to the ground as he worked. After 20 minutes, the edge of a metal door appeared behind the covering. It was old and rusted, but clearly made to be hidden. Rick brushed the dust away, revealing a heavy steel door with a broken lock. It had no handle, just a small gap near the side. He used his crowbar again, pushing with all his strength. The door gave a long creak and slowly opened inward. A wave of cold air hit him as he pointed his flashlight inside. The space beyond was darker, untouched even longer than the first room. He stepped in carefully, dust swirling around his feet. This room looked different. It wasn't just storage. It looked like a place people once worked in. There were desks, chairs, maps pinned to the walls, and large machines with wires and dials. At the center of the room was a large wooden table with maps spread across it. Red lines and small pins covered Europe, parts of Asia, and the Atlantic Ocean. Some notes were written in faded ink. One note said, "Monitor all radio messages from German HQ." Another read, "Keep code changes secure. Possible leak suspected." Rick's heart pounded. This wasn't a collector's room. This was a real wartime command center. It looked like something from a movie, but it was real. His flashlight moved to a large locker in the corner. He opened it slowly and found more documents. But this time, there were also medals, ID tags, and worn leather boots. He picked up one folder and opened it. It held letters from U.S. generals and even a British admiral. Most were short but serious. Supply transport received. Do not delay encryption updates. Continue working under radar. Civilians must not know. Rick sat down slowly in one of the dusty chairs. He tried to imagine what his uncle had done. Was he part of a secret group during the war? Was this a hidden base no one else knew about? It seemed impossible, but the room around him said otherwise. Then he saw something small and shiny under the table. He reached down and picked it up. It was a thin gold necklace with a silver ring hanging from it. The initials, J.M., were carved into the ring. Joseph Miller, his uncle. Rick held the ring tightly in his hand. His uncle must have spent time in this room, maybe even lived here for a while. Beside the ring was a leather-bound journal, older and thicker than the first one. Rick opened it and found pages full of notes, some in code, some in plain writing. One page made his breath catch. "The war took everything from me, but I saved what I could. If my nephew finds this, tell him I did it for the truth." Rick closed the journal and held it to his chest. His uncle hadn't just collected old items. He had lived through history and left it behind. Not for money, not for fame, but to make sure it wouldn't be forgotten. Later that evening, Rick showed the new room to Karen, the museum historian. She was speechless as she walked around, touching the dusty maps and machines. "This is beyond anything we expected," she whispered. She called the museum director right away. Within days, new experts were sent to the site. They confirmed it. Rick had found one of the few remaining private Allied war rooms in the country. Most were destroyed or hidden after the war ended. His uncle's was fully intact. A frozen piece of the 1940s, reporters returned, and the story spread again. Now bigger than before, Rick was invited to speak at a veterans event. He stood before a crowd of old soldiers and young students, holding his uncle's journal. "My uncle never told me any of this," he said, "but he left it for someone to find. I think he trusted me to finish what he started." The audience clapped, some with tears in their eyes. One old man, a World War II vet, shook Rick's hand and said, "Your uncle was a silent hero. And now so are you." Back at home, Max hugged him tightly and said, "I'm proud of you, Dad." Rick smiled and knelt down. "I'm proud of us, buddy. We're telling a story no one else could." And in the quiet of the night, Rick looked at the stars above the junkyard. What was once a forgotten place of metal and rust had become something sacred, a home for stories, secrets, and history. And he was ready to keep digging, not just through the dirt, but through the truth, hidden one page and one crate at a time. He still didn't know why his uncle hid it all, but he was getting closer to the answer with every step. Rick's story had now reached far beyond the small town. What started as a single dad fixing up a junkyard had become national news. TV trucks parked outside the fence, reporters waited near the gate, and photographers asked for a chance to see the bunker. But Rick didn't open the door for just anyone. He knew now how valuable everything inside was, not just in money, but in meaning. He wanted to protect it, just like his uncle had done for so many years. The museum had already taken some items for display with Rick's permission. They set up a special section called The Hidden Bunker, and people from all over came to visit. Rick and Max even got a private tour. Max's eyes lit up when he saw his dad's name on a plaque beside the Enigma machine. "That's us," Max whispered proudly, and Rick smiled, his heart full. But not everyone was happy about Rick's discovery. One day, a lawyer showed up at the junkyard with a briefcase and serious eyes. He claimed to represent a group that wanted the items returned to the proper government agency. Rick didn't understand at first. "My uncle owned this land and everything on it," he said. The lawyer gave him a polite but cold smile. "Some of these items were once military property. There may be legal claims." Rick nodded slowly but didn't answer right away. He didn't trust this man or the people behind him. He called Karen at the museum for help. She contacted her team, and soon Rick had real historians and lawyers on his side. Together, they researched old laws, letters, and property papers. Rick's uncle had indeed signed ownership of the land and everything on it years ago, and he had written clearly in his journals that he saved the items from being destroyed after the war. The museum director even said, "Your uncle was a protector of history, not a thief." Still, Rick felt the pressure. He wanted to do the right thing, but he also wanted to protect Max. He didn't want to be pulled into a long legal fight that might hurt their new life. So he made a decision. He would share the story with the world on his terms. He agreed to do a special TV documentary with a trusted history channel. They would film the bunker, interview experts, and tell the story of Joseph Miller, the quiet man who saved the past. Rick stood in front of the camera with Max by his side. He told the story from the beginning, how he inherited a junkyard, how people laughed, and how he found the hatch. He showed the bunker, the maps, the machines, and the journals. People watching from home were shocked, moved, and inspired. Many sent messages, thanking Rick for keeping the memory of real heroes alive. Some veterans even sent letters, saying the story helped them feel remembered and proud again. After the documentary aired, the attention grew even more. A famous collector offered Rick $5 million for the whole collection. Rick said no. A movie producer called, asking to buy the rights to turn the story into a film. Rick said he'd think about it, but only if they told the story with truth and respect. At night, Rick sat outside, the stars shining above the junkyard. Max sat beside him with a blanket, leaning against his shoulder. "Do you think Uncle Joe is happy we found everything?" Max asked softly. Rick looked up at the sky, smiling. "Yeah, I think he's proud." But there was one more thing that still haunted Rick, the codes in the journal. He had shown them to experts, but many were still not fully solved. One page had strange numbers and letters that seemed different from the rest. Karen and her team believed it might point to something else, maybe another hidden room or a buried box. Rick began searching the rest of the junkyard more carefully, following clues from the journal. One morning, near the far edge of the yard where old engines were stacked, Rick found a strange stone. It was flat and square, and when he lifted it, he saw something metal underneath. A small handle, partly rusted but still strong. He called Karen right away, and they opened it together. Inside was a small box wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax. They took it to the museum and opened it carefully. Inside were letters, real, personal letters from soldiers to their families. Some were never sent, still in their envelopes. There were also black and white photos of soldiers smiling, hugging, laughing. It was like finding the voices of the past lost but now remembered. Rick read one letter out loud at a school event. A week later, a young girl in the front row cried softly as he read the words of a soldier to his little sister. Rick paused and said, "These men had names, families, dreams. They weren't just part of history, they were people." The room was silent, full of respect. Rick wasn't just sharing old things anymore. He was giving memories back to the world. That night, he stood once again by the junkyard gate. He looked out at the metal piles, the dust, the memories. He no longer saw trash, he saw truth. He saw honor. And he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. A junkyard no one wanted had become a treasure the world needed, and Rick, the single dad once laughed at, had become its protector, its voice, and its legacy. A few days after the school event, Rick sat alone in his kitchen, flipping through the older journal again. The words written by his uncle still echoed in his mind. "If you're reading this, then you found it. I did what I had to do." Rick had read those lines many times, but that morning, something felt different. He went back to the last few pages of the journal and noticed something he had missed. Tucked between two pages was a folded envelope, yellowed with age and sealed with wax. His hand shook slightly as he broke the seal and pulled out the paper inside. It wasn't long. Just a short handwritten note in faded black ink. "For my nephew Rick, if you've come this far, I'm proud of you. I didn't have my own children, but you were like a son to me. I couldn't tell you all this before I passed, but I knew one day you would find it. I hid it all for a reason. The war ended, but not all battles were over. Keep the truth safe, and remember me not as a soldier, but as a man who tried to protect what mattered." Rick stared at the words for a long time, his eyes filling with tears. He placed the letter on the table and looked out the window toward the junkyard. His uncle had trusted him all along. He didn't leave him junk, he left him a mission to protect stories, memories, and truth. That same afternoon, Rick called the local newspaper and asked if he could publish the letter. He wanted people to know who his uncle really was, not just a man who hid war items, but a man who cared about history, honor, and family. The paper ran the story on the front page with the title, "The Quiet Hero of Miller Junkyard." Soon after, something unexpected happened. Rick received a phone call from a woman named Sarah, who said she had served as a military nurse during the war. She was in her 90s now, but her voice was strong. She said, "I think I knew your uncle. We worked in the same base in 1945. He was quiet but kind. Always carried a notebook." Rick was stunned. "Do you remember anything else about him?" he asked. She paused, then said, "He told me once, if things go wrong, I'll make sure the memories live somewhere safe." That sentence stayed with Rick. His uncle had started this plan even before the war ended. He had slowly collected letters, equipment, stories, and hidden them, not for money, but to keep them from being lost or destroyed. Rick wanted to honor that, so he began to write a book. He wrote every evening, using the journals, the letters, and the stories told by people like Sarah. He titled it, "The Last Journal, A Hidden War Room and the Man Who Saved It." As he wrote, More people came forward, veterans and their families. Some donated items, others shared letters or photos. Rick added them to the story. Page by page, one day, Max walked into the room holding a drawing he made at school. It showed Rick standing in front of the junkyard, with words above it that said, "My dad saved history." Rick picked him up and hugged him tight. "I couldn't have done it without you," he whispered. Max smiled. "We're a team, right?" Rick nodded, always. That week, a package arrived in the mail. It had no return address, just a small note inside. "He would have wanted you to have this." Inside was a pocket watch, old but beautiful, with JM carved on the back. Rick opened it, and it was still ticking. He smiled and placed it on the shelf beside the journal. Later, Rick visited the museum again. Where the display now had grown larger, there were new items, letters, even a recorded voice clip of his uncle that Sarah had sent from an old radio tape. As Rick stood in front of the glass case, he felt something inside him shift. He had gone from being laughed at to being respected, but more importantly, he had found connection, purpose, and peace. Outside the museum, a young boy walked up to him with a notebook. "Mr. Rick, can you sign this? I want to be like you someday." Rick smiled and signed it with shaky hands. "You can be better than me," he said. "Just listen to the stories around you." Back at the junkyard that night, Rick walked through the rows of old metal. He no longer saw a pile of broken things. He saw memories. He stopped by the hatch, placed his hand on it, and whispered, "Thank you, Uncle Joe." The stars were bright above, and the wind was gentle. It felt like something sacred was resting in that place, and Rick knew, without a doubt, that he had done the right thing. He didn't find gold, or diamonds, or fame. He found something far more valuable: truth, memory, and love. And he knew that his uncle's voice, once lost in silence, was now heard all around the world. Because of him, the past had come back to life, and the boy people once laughed at had become a guardian of history. Months had passed since Rick first found the hidden hatch in the junkyard. His life had changed in a way he never imagined. The man who was once laughed at for inheriting piles of broken junk was now known across the country, not because he chased fame or money, but because he respected what others had forgotten. Rick stood at the edge of the junkyard one quiet morning, watching Max play near a stack of tires. He smiled, feeling peace inside his heart. The junkyard, once full of rust and silence, now held meaning. It had become a place of learning, memory, and history. The museum had finished building a full-size replica of the hidden war room. It included real pieces from the bunker, voice recordings from veterans, and photos of Uncle Joe. School groups visited every week, and Rick often gave short talks about how it all began. He didn't talk like a teacher, just like a man who found something and followed his heart. People respected that more than any expert lecture. One day, a government officer from the Capitol contacted him again, but this time not with threats or legal demands. Instead, he said, "Mr. Rick, we would like to honor your uncle officially." Rick was surprised. Honor him how? The man explained that they planned to award Joseph Miller a special posthumous Medal I, given to civilians who helped protect national history. Rick felt a lump in his throat. He would have been proud. He said softly. The ceremony was planned for Veterans Day, and Rick was asked to accept the medal on his uncle's behalf. When the day came, Rick dressed in a simple suit, holding Max's hand. The event took place on the museum's front lawn, with flags waving and veterans sitting in the front row. The speaker told Joe's story, how he saved rare items, kept letters, and built a hidden bunker beneath an old junkyard. Then he called Rick to the stage, and the crowd stood up in applause. Rick walked slowly to the podium, his heart pounding but his voice calm. He held up the medal and said, "My uncle was a quiet man. He never told me what he had done or why he did it, but I now understand he wanted the world to remember, not just the war, but the people in it, the letters, the uniforms, the lives. He didn't save treasure, he saved truth, and I promise to carry that truth forward Tears rolled down people's faces as he spoke. Max clapped the loudest, shouting, "That's my dad!" Rick laughed and waved to him, feeling prouder than ever before. After the ceremony, Rick decided to create something more, with help from the museum and donations from people who believed in the cause. He built a small building beside the Junkyard. It wasn't big or fancy, but it had space for exhibits, school tours, and guest speakers. He named it the Miller Memory House. It became a place where people could learn, not just about the war, but about what it means to remember. Veterans came to visit, leaving behind their own letters and keepsakes. Families brought photos of grandfathers and great-grandmothers who had served. Rick made sure everything was handled with care, just like his uncle would have wanted. He placed a wooden sign above the entrance that read, "Every story matters, big or small." Max helped too, giving small tours to kids his age. He would say proudly, "This is my dad's place." And my great-uncle's too. The kids would ask questions, and Max would answer with excitement. Rick often watched from the doorway, smiling, knowing his son was growing up with a strong heart. One evening, as the sun set over the rows of scrap metal, Rick sat on the porch with a warm drink. He looked over the land, now no longer just a junkyard. It was a field of memories, and all because one man had chosen to save instead of throw away, to protect instead of forget. He opened the pocket watch one more time, the one with Uncle Joe's initials still ticking after all these years. He whispered, "I did it, Joe. I told your story. The world knows now, and it will never be lost again." Rick didn't become rich, but he gained something more valuable than money: respect, purpose, and peace. The laughter from the past was now replaced by applause, gratitude, and silence filled with meaning. And as the stars appeared in the sky above, Rick knew this was the end of one chapter, but not the end of the journey, because the truth never dies, it just waits for someone to find it. And thanks to one single dad and one forgotten junkyard, the truth was finally free, and it would live forever.